The winter of 1897 descended upon Silver Creek Valley with the weight of a judgment, a heavy, suffocating blanket of white that seemed determined to bury the past and the present alike. It arrived not with the gentle drifting of snowflakes that one might read about in storybooks, but with a howling fury that rattled the timber frames of the homesteads scattered along the ridge. The frost was a living thing, creeping across the window panes of the small, weathered cabin, forming intricate, jagged patterns that obscured the outside world. To the inhabitants of the cabin, the frost felt like bars on a cage, locking them into a silence that was becoming louder with every passing day. Inside, the air was only marginally warmer than the biting wind outside. Mai stood at the kitchen window, her breath hitching in her throat, manifesting as small, fleeting clouds against the glass. She was 20 years old, though the last few months had etched a weariness into her features that belonged to a woman twice her age. Beside her, identical in every feature save for a small mole on her left earlobe, stood her sister, Lee. They were dressed in light pink prairie dresses, garments that had once been vibrant and joyful, sewn by their mother for the spring festival 2 years prior. Now, the fabric was faded, the hems frayed from constant wear, and the color seemed woefully out of place against the harsh, monochromatic grayscale of the winter landscape. They wore layers of woolen shawls over the thin cotton, but the cold found its way through, settling into their bones. The sisters stared out at the relentless snow, which fell in a steady, silent curtain, erasing the path to the main road. Behind them, the cast-iron stove radiated a pathetic amount of heat. They were down to the last quarter of the woodshed. The logs that remained had to last until the thaw, which the farmer's almanac, and the ache in Mai's joints, predicted would not arrive until late March. For weeks, Mai had been performing a grim calculus in her mind, the same precise mathematics she once used to balance her father's ledger at the mercantile. They were alone. Their father, a man of immense dignity who had brought them from Guangdong to the American West with dreams of gold and land, had passed in the autumn of 1896. Their mother, whose laughter used to fill the drafty cabin with warmth, followed him 6 months later, taken by a fever that swept through the valley with the speed of a prairie fire. Now, it was December 24th. The cupboard contained a small sack of rice, less than a cup of dried beans, and a jar of pickled vegetables they had been rationing since October. "It's sticking," Lee whispered, her voice cracking slightly. She pressed her hand against the cold glass. "The snow. It's not stopping, Mai." Mai reached out and took her sister's hand, squeezing it firmly. "It will stop eventually, Lee. The storms always pass." "But what comes after?" Lee asked, turning her dark eyes toward her sister. "We have nothing for tomorrow. No offering for the ancestors. No meal for ourselves. It's Christmas Eve, and we have nothing." Mai looked away, unable to bear the fear in her twin's eyes because it mirrored her own too perfectly. "We have each other," she said, though the words felt hollow against the growling of their empty stomachs. "And we have rice. We will make a porridge. We will be warm enough." But she knew it was a lie. The valley was unforgiving to men with strong backs and full larders, to 2 orphaned Chinese women with no livestock and dwindling supplies. It was a death sentence. They had tried to maintain the farm, but the drought in the summer had withered their vegetable patch, and the prejudice of the townspeople made commerce difficult. When they went into town, heads were turned, or prices were suddenly raised. They had retreated to the cabin, hoping to ride out the winter on what their father had saved, but the savings were gone. The silence in the house was a physical weight. In the corner, the grandfather clock ticked away the seconds with mechanical indifference. It was a sound that used to comfort them, a heartbeat of the home, but now it sounded like a countdown. Mai turned from the window and looked at the empty kitchen table. She had scrubbed it yesterday, an automatic act of muscle memory. The grain of the wood was visible where the finish had rubbed away, worn smooth by years of family meals that would never happen again. "I should check the trap lines," Mai said, moving toward the door, though she knew the traps had been empty for a week. "No," Lee said, grabbing her arm. "It's too cold. The wind is howling, Mai. If you get lost in the white oak." She didn't finish the sentence. They both knew the danger. To be alone was terrifying, to be the surviving one was a fate worse than death. My nodded and pulled her shawl tighter. She moved to the stove and added a single, small log. It was a gamble, spending fuel they might need in January, but the cold was seeping through the floorboards, making their teeth chatter. The afternoon light began to bleed from the sky, turning the grey world into a deep, bruising purple. The temperature dropped further. Just as Mai was resigning herself to a dinner of watery rice water, a sound cut through the howling wind. It was a heavy, rhythmic thud. Then the creak of wood. Then the jingle of a harness. Both sisters froze. Visitors were rare. Visitors in a blizzard were unheard of. In the Wild West, a stranger approaching an isolated cabin could mean salvation, or it could mean danger. Mai moved to the drawer where their father kept his old Colt revolver, though she had no bullets left. She held the heavy steel for comfort. "Stay behind me," Mai whispered to Lee. The sound stopped outside their porch. Heavy boots crunched on the frozen snow. Then, 3 sharp raps on the door. Firm. Deliberate. Mai waited. The knock came again. "Miss Chen?" "Miss Lee." A deep voice called out, muffled by the thick timber of the door. "It's Ethan Grant. From the ridge over yonder." Mai lowered the gun slightly. Ethan Grant. She knew the name. He was a rancher who lived 3 miles to the west. Their father had spoken of him with respect, a man who kept to himself, who paid his debts, and who had never looked at their family with the slanted eyes of suspicion that others in the valley held. Mai moved to the door, unlocking the bolt with trembling fingers. She opened it a crack, and the winter rushed in like a physical blow, swirling snow onto the floorboards. Standing on the porch, backlit by the fading twilight, was a giant of a man. Ethan Grant was in his late 40s, his face weathered like old leather, creased at the corners of his eyes from years of squinting into the sun and wind. He wore a heavy buffalo coat dusted with snow, and his hat was pulled low. Behind him, a wagon was pulled by a massive roan horse, steam rising from its nostrils. "Mr. Grant?" Mai asked, her voice steady despite the cold. He took his hat off, revealing hair that was graying at the temples. He looked at the two of them, taking in their thin pink dresses and the poverty that clung to the room behind them. His eyes, a piercing blue, softened. "I apologize for the intrusion, ladies," he said, his voice a low rumble. "I was heading back from the mercantile in town, and... well, the roads are getting bad. I saw your chimney smoke was looking a mite thin." He looked past her shoulder, his gaze landing on the empty table. He didn't stare, but he saw. He saw everything. "We are fine, Mr. Grant," Mai said, her pride flaring up, a last defense against the pity of the world. "We are managing." Ethan nodded slowly, turning his hat in his large, gloved hands. "I'm sure you are. You're your father's daughters, after all." He was a good man. Strong. He paused, looking down at his boots. "But this winter. It's a creditor collecting debts, isn't it? It doesn't care about strength." He gestured toward his wagon. "I have a bit of a situation, you see. I overbought. Way overbought. And with the snow coming down like this, I can't keep all this fresh food in the wagon, and it'll spoil or freeze wrong if I leave it in the barn. I was hoping you might help me out by taking some of it off my hands." Neighbors helping neighbors. Mai looked at Lee, whose eyes were wide. They both knew it was a lie. You didn't overbuy in the winter, you hoarded. And nothing spoiled in freezing temperatures, it just froze. He was offering charity, but he was dressing it up as a favor to save their dignity. "Mr. Grant," Lee spoke up, her voice soft. "We cannot pay you." "Didn't ask for payment," Ethan said gently. "The payment is you helping me not be wasteful." My Clara. My late wife. She hated waste. She'd haunt me if I let good food go to the wolves. He didn't wait for permission. He turned and walked back to the wagon, his boots crunching heavily. He returned a moment later carrying a large wooden crate, effortlessly lifting a weight that would have taken both sisters to move. He stepped inside, kicking the snow from his boots, and set the crate on the kitchen table. "Now," he said, breathing into his hands. "I've got a turkey in the back of the wagon. Big Tom. Already dressed. And a ham. Smoked it myself." Mai stepped forward and looked into the crate. Her breath caught in her throat. There were potatoes, real, earth-covered potatoes. There was a sack of white flour. A bag of sugar. A jar of honey. Coffee beans that smelled so rich and dark it made her head spin. And wrapped in butcher paper, thick cuts of beef. Ethan went back out and returned with a canvas sack and a massive ham. It sent smoky and sweet filling the frozen room. He made a third trip for the turkey. When he was finally done, the kitchen table, which had been a barren wasteland of wood grain moments before, was groaning under the weight of a feast. The twins stood paralyzed. It was too much. It was months of survival. It was a life raft thrown into a drowning sea. "Why?" Mai asked, looking up at him. Tears finally spilling over, freezing on her cheeks. "Why would you do this for us? We are strangers." Ethan stood by the door, looking uncomfortable with the gratitude. He brushed snow from his sleeve. "You aren't strangers. You're neighbors. In this valley, that means family." And besides, he paused, his voice catching on a rough edge of emotion. "My wife died 3 winters back. And my daughter. She would have been about your age." He looked at the two of them, shivering in their pink dresses, and the grief in his eyes was a deep, ancient well. "People brought me food then. Checked on me. I didn't want it. I was angry at the world. But it kept me alive. I'm just balancing the ledger." He turned to leave. "I should get the horse back to the barn before the drifts get too high." "Stay," Lee said suddenly. The word hung in the air. Mai looked at her sister, then at Ethan. "Yes. Please. Stay. We cannot cook all this ourselves. And no one should be alone on Christmas Eve." Ethan hesitated. He looked at the cold, dark ride that awaited him, and then at the warm, golden light of the kerosene lamp the sisters had just lit. He looked at the food he had brought, and then at the faces of the 2 young women who looked at him not with suspicion, but with a dawn of hope. "I've got the horse to tend to," he said weakly. "There is a stall in the barn," Mai said. "It is empty. There is hay left. And we will make coffee," Lee added. "Real coffee." Slowly, a smile broke across Ethan's weathered face, cracking the mask of solitude he had worn for 3 years. "Well," he said, closing the door against the wind. "I suppose a cup of coffee wouldn't hurt." The next few hours were a blur of activity that transformed the gloomy cabin into a place of light and warmth. Ethan, it turned out, was handy with more than just a wagon. He went out to the woodpile and, despite the dark, managed to chop and haul enough wood to fill the box by the stove, getting the fire roaring until the cast iron glowed with a heat they hadn't felt in weeks. The twins moved with a synchronized grace that seemed to fascinate the rancher. Mai prepared the ham, scoring the fat and glazing it with the honey and a bit of the sugar. Lee peeled potatoes, her hands moving deftly. They worked in silence, a twin talk of shared glances and subtle nods, but the atmosphere was no longer heavy. It was electric with anticipation. The smell of the coffee brewing, strong, black, and life-affirming, permeated the room. Ethan sat in the corner chair, whittling a small piece of wood, watching them with a quiet contentment. "My Clara," Ethan said, breaking the silence as the ham sizzled in the oven, "she used to make these dumplings. Little pockets of dough." "Jiaozi," Mai said, turning from the flour she was kneading for biscuits. "We make them too. For the new year. But we have no cabbage or pork for the filling." Ethan stood up and walked to the crate. He dug around the bottom and pulled out a smaller, wrapped package he hadn't mentioned. "Is this pork?" He held up a slab of bacon and some ground sausage. "And I think there's an onion in the sack." The twins looked at each other, a spark of pure joy passing between them. We can make them, Lee said, clapping her hands. We can make dumplings. And so, the cultural lines that usually divided the valley dissolved in the heat of the kitchen. The rancher watched as the Chinese sisters rolled out dough with a glass bottle because they had no rolling pin, filling the wrappers with the sausage and onion, pleating them with a dexterity that looked like magic. In return, Ethan showed them how to make cowboy biscuits, using the bacon grease to make them savory and dense. By the time the meal was ready, the blizzard outside was a distant concern. The wind battered the walls, but the cabin held firm, fortified by the heat of the stove and the warmth of human connection. They pushed the table near the stove. The feast was eclectic: a glazed ham, roasted potatoes, fluffy biscuits, and a platter of steamed dumplings. It was a meal that defied geography, a dinner that belonged nowhere but the American West. They sat down. Ethan felt large and clumsy in the small chair, but he didn't mind. Mai and Lee had draped their shawls over the backs of their chairs, the heat of the room finally allowing them to be comfortable in their pink dresses. We usually offer a prayer to our ancestors, Mai said, looking at the food. To invite them to eat with us. Ethan nodded respectfully. I'd be honored if you did. Mai and Lee closed their eyes, bowing their heads. They spoke softly in Cantonese, inviting the spirits of their father and mother to partake in the abundance, thanking them for watching over the house. When they finished, they looked at Ethan. And I usually say grace, Ethan said. He bowed his head. Lord, we thank you for this food. We thank you for unexpected company. We ask you to bless this house and these young women. And tell Clara I miss her. Amen. Amen, the sisters whispered. They ate with the hunger of those who had been starving not just for food, but for fellowship. The ham was salty and sweet, melting on the tongue. The biscuits were warm and comforting. And when Ethan tried a dumpling, his eyes widened. That, he said, pointing his fork at the dumpling, is the best thing I've tasted in 20 years. Lee giggled, a sound that seemed to startle even herself. She hadn't laughed since the spring. As the meal progressed, the stories began to flow. Ethan spoke of his youth, coming west on a cattle drive, the wildness of the land before the fences went up. He spoke of his wife, Clara, not with the sharp pain of fresh grief, but with the fond melancholy of a scar that has healed. The twins spoke of their journey across the ocean, the smell of the salt air, the strangeness of the mountains. They spoke of their father's dream to build a legacy, and their mother's insistence that they never forget their language. I have a question, Ethan said later, as they sat nursing their third cups of coffee. Those dresses. They're mighty fine, but they don't look like winter clothes. Mai looked down at the pink fabric. She smoothed the frayed hem. Our mother made them. For the spring festival. It was the last thing she sewed before she got sick. We wear them when we need to feel close to her. When we need to remember that spring always returns. Ethan was silent for a long time. He looked at the fire, the light dancing in his blue eyes. She was right, he said softly. Spring does return. But sometimes, you need help getting through the winter to see it. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small leather pouch. He placed it on the table. I didn't want to bring this up before dinner, he said. But your father. He did some work for me a few years back. Helped me fix a fence line that had washed out in the flood. He refused payment at the time. Said he was just being neighborly. Mai frowned. Father never mentioned that. He wouldn't have, Ethan said. He was a proud man. But I kept the money aside. Invested it in a few head of cattle. It's grown a bit. He pushed the pouch toward them. It clinked heavily. That's not charity, Ethan said firmly, seeing Mai about to protest. That's a return on investment. It's yours. It should be enough to buy seed for the spring planting, and maybe some warmer clothes for the rest of the winter. Mai opened the pouch. Inside were gold coins. Real, heavy gold coins. It was more money than they had seen in their lives. It wasn't just survival, it was a future. Mr. Grantley whispered. Ethan, he corrected. Please. If we're going to be eating dumplings together, you have to call me Ethan. Ethan, Mai said, her voice trembling. We cannot take this. You can, and you will, he said, his voice leaving no room for argument. Because I'm an old man with no family, and I'm looking to hire some help. I need folks who can do figures and keep books. My ranch is getting too big for me to manage the numbers alone. I hear you two are wizards with mathematics. It was a ruse, partially. A way to give them dignity along with the help. But as he looked at them, intelligent, resilient, survivors, he realized it wasn't entirely a lie. They were exactly the kind of spirit the valley needed. We are good with numbers, Mai admitted, a small smile touching her lips. Then it settled, Ethan said, slapping his knee. Business partners. The night deepened, but the fear that had plagued the cabin for months was gone, banished by the aroma of roast turkey and the sound of voices. They sat by the fire until the embers burned low. Ethan slept in the armchair, refusing to take the sisters' bed, his heavy coat acting as a blanket. Mai and Lee slept in their room, huddled together under their quilts. For the first time in months, Mai didn't dream of the cold. She dreamed of the spring. She dreamed of green shoots pushing up through the black earth, of the creek running clear and cold, and of the pink dresses dancing in a warm breeze. Christmas morning broke with a brilliance that blinded. The storm had passed, leaving the world scoured clean and covered in a diamond dust of snow. The sun was a hard, bright coin in the sky. Ethan left after a breakfast of heated-up leftovers and fresh coffee. He hitched up the roan horse, the wagon now light and empty. I'll be back in a few days, he said, standing on the porch. To check on those books we talked about. And to bring more wood. That pile is looking sad. We will be here, Mai said. She stood next to Lee, both of them wrapped in their shawls, but standing straighter than they had the day before. Merry Christmas, Mai. Merry Christmas, Lee, Ethan said, tipping his hat. Merry Christmas, Ethan, they said in unison. They watched him ride away, a dark silhouette against the blinding white of the valley. He wasn't just a neighbor anymore. He wasn't just a rancher. He was the man who had crossed the frozen divide of prejudice and grief to find them. My turn to Lee, he is right, you know. About what? Lee asked, watching the wagon disappear. Spring is coming, Mai said. She looked down at her pink dress, then up at the blue sky. But until it gets here, we are going to be just fine. They turned and went back inside the cabin. It was still a small, wooden house on a lonely ridge. The wind still blew, and the world was still hard. But as the door clicked shut, it didn't sound like a cage closing anymore. It sounded like a home, safe and warm, filled with the lingering scent of turkey, the promise of the future, and the invisible, unbreakable threads of a new family forged in the heart of winter. The creditors of winter had come to collect, but love, unexpected and rugged, had paid the debt in full.